"Mom, you're living in the past." My son Ryan said it with a tired smile as he reached for another dinner roll. The words should have sounded harmless, maybe even reasonable. Instead, they landed with a weight that stayed with me long after the plates were cleared. Melissa, my daughter-in-law, laughed softly and shook her head. "Honestly, Evelyn, you keep everything. Old letters, old photos, old furniture. You should let some of it go." I smiled politely and looked down at my plate. At 71, I had learned that arguing rarely changed anyone's mind. The dining room around us glowed with warm light. The same oak table my husband Robert and I had bought 34 years earlier sat between us. The same framed family photos lined the walls. To Ryan and Melissa, those things were clutter. To me, they were pieces of a life. "You'd feel so much lighter if you stopped holding on to the past," Ryan added. I nodded as if I agreed. But inside, something hurt. Not because of what he said, because he sounded exactly like someone repeating an idea that wasn't originally his. The conversation moved on. They started discussing real estate prices and neighborhoods across town. Melissa mentioned how much larger their house could be if they sold mine and combined resources for a newer property. She said it casually, as if she were discussing the weather. I noticed she never asked whether I wanted to leave my home. By the time they drove away, the night air had turned cool. I stood alone on my front porch watching their taillights disappear down the street. The neighborhood was quiet. A gentle breeze moved through the maple trees Robert had planted years ago. For a moment, I could almost hear his voice telling me not to worry so much. The house felt larger after he died. Not empty, just different. Every room carried memories. Every corner held evidence that a good man had once lived there. I locked the front door and began my usual routine. I washed the dishes, folded a kitchen towel, turned off the dining room light. Then I noticed something I hadn't paid attention to in years. A small attic key hanging on a hook inside the pantry. My hand froze. The attic. I hadn't gone up there since Robert passed away 3 years earlier. I couldn't explain why, but suddenly I felt drawn to it. Maybe it was Ryan's comment. Maybe it was simple curiosity. Or maybe it was something else entirely. 20 minutes later, I stood beneath the pull-down ladder holding a flashlight. Dust floated through the beam of light as I climbed slowly into the attic. Boxes sat untouched beneath the slanted roof. Christmas decorations. Old tax records. Furniture covered by white sheets. Then I saw it. A cedar box resting alone in the far corner. I didn't remember placing it there. I carried it carefully downstairs and set it on the kitchen table. My heart beat faster than it should have. The brass latch clicked open. Inside were photographs, a few documents, and an envelope with my name written across the front in Robert's unmistakable handwriting. My fingers trembled as I picked it up. Beneath my name was a single sentence. "Open this when nobody believes you anymore." In that moment, I realized my husband hadn't left me a memory. He had left me a message. I sat at the kitchen table for a long time staring at the envelope. The house was silent except for the steady ticking of the wall clock above the refrigerator. Robert had installed that clock himself nearly 20 years ago. He used to joke that every home needed one honest thing that never rushed and never lied. That night, every tick seemed louder than usual. The envelope felt heavier than paper should have felt. I turned it over in my hands several times before finally breaking the seal. Inside was a single handwritten letter folded neatly into thirds. Robert had always written carefully. Every letter looked as though he had taken his time with each word. I unfolded the pages and immediately recognized the familiar blue ink he preferred. "Evelyn, if you are reading this, then something has happened that forced you to look beyond what everyone else wants you to see." I stopped reading and closed my eyes for a moment. It felt strange seeing his words again. For 3 years, I had missed the simple things most. His voice from another room. The sound of his footsteps in the hallway. The way he would reach for my hand during long drives without even thinking about it. I took a slow breath and continued. There may come a day when people tell you that your memories no longer matter. If that day arrives, do not believe them. Sometimes the truth survives only because someone remembers where it was hidden. A chill ran through me despite the warm kitchen. Robert was not the type of man who wrote dramatic letters. He was practical, thoughtful, careful with words. If he had written something like this, there was a reason. The next paragraph made my pulse quicken. There is a cedar box beneath this letter. Inside are photographs and copies of documents. Do not throw them away. One day they may become important. I looked down into the box again. Beneath the envelope sat several old photographs bound together with a faded rubber band. I lifted them carefully. Most were ordinary family pictures. Birthday parties, summer barbecues, vacations at the lake. Ryan as a boy holding a fishing rod almost taller than he was. Then I noticed something unusual. Several photographs had dates written on the back in Robert's handwriting. The dates were circled, as though he wanted me to pay attention to them. I set the pictures aside and reached for a manila folder underneath. Inside were photocopies of paperwork I did not recognize. Some pages contained legal language. Others appeared to be financial records. I was not sure what any of it meant. Yet Robert had saved them for a reason. My eyes returned to the letter. If you need answers, contact Harold Bennett. Do not delay. He will know what to do. Harold Bennett. The name immediately sounded familiar. Robert and I had known Harold for years. He handled legal matters for several families in town. But I had not spoken to him since Robert's funeral. The final sentence on the page was underlined. Trust your memory, Evelyn. There are things you noticed long ago, but never fully understood. I read those words 3 times. Then I folded the letter carefully and placed it back inside the envelope. The kitchen suddenly felt different. Not frightening, not mysterious, just awake somehow. As though pieces of a puzzle had quietly begun moving after years of standing still. Outside, the first light of morning was beginning to touch the windows. I had spent the entire night reading and thinking. As I looked around the room, small memories surfaced without invitation. Melissa asking unusual questions about paperwork. Ryan insisting that certain documents were probably outdated. Conversations I had dismissed at the time because I trusted them. I stood and carried the folder into the living room. On the mantel sat a framed photograph of Robert smiling beside our garden. For a moment I stared at it. Then I looked back at the folder in my hands. Whatever Robert had wanted me to find, it was not simply a collection of old papers. And for the first time in years, I felt something stronger than grief. I felt curiosity. I called Harold Bennett at 9:15 the next morning. I expected to reach a receptionist or leave a voicemail. Instead, Harold answered on the second ring. His voice sounded older than I remembered, but still steady. When I introduced myself, there was a brief silence. Evelyn, he said carefully, I have been wondering whether I would ever hear from you. The comment caught me off guard. I glanced down at the folder resting beside my coffee cup. You knew about this? I asked. Another pause followed. I knew Robert left instructions, Harold replied. What I did not know was whether you would ever find them. Less than an hour later, I was driving across town. The morning sun reflected off storefront windows as I made my way toward Harold's office. The building looked exactly as it had years ago. Red brick, white columns, a small American flag near the entrance. Some places seemed immune to time. Harold greeted me personally. He led me into a private conference room and closed the door behind us. The room smelled faintly of coffee and old books. I placed the folder on the polished table between us. Harold looked at it and nodded slowly. You found the cedar box. It was not a question. Yes, I said, and I need to understand why Robert wanted me to find it. Harold folded his hands. Before we discuss the documents, tell me something. Why did you open the box now? The question seemed strange. Yet I answered honestly. I told him about dinner, about Ryan and Melissa, about being told I needed to let go of the past. I expected sympathy. Instead, Harold looked thoughtful. Interesting, he said quietly. Very interesting. He opened the folder and began reviewing the documents one by one. Occasionally he nodded. Occasionally he frowned. Finally he leaned back in his chair. Robert was a careful man, he said. He noticed things other people missed. I remembered those words from countless years of marriage. Robert always paid attention. Small details, tiny inconsistencies, things most people ignored. What exactly did he notice? I asked. Harold hesitated. That is what concerns me. He slid one photograph across the table. It was a family picture taken nearly 8 years earlier during a 4th of July barbecue. Everyone was smiling. Children were running through sprinklers. Nothing appeared unusual. Turn it over, Harold said. On the back was one of the dates Robert had circled. Alongside it, a short handwritten note appeared. Keep track of who asks about the house. A strange feeling settled in my stomach. Harold handed me another photograph. Then another. Each one carried a similar note. Different dates. Different occasions. Similar observations. Questions about property. Questions about paperwork. Questions about ownership. The words felt harmless by themselves. Yet together they formed a pattern. I do not understand, I admitted. Harold removed a thin file from his briefcase. Neither did I at first, he said. But Robert asked me to hold this file if anything ever happened to him. My eyes remained fixed on the folder in his hands. What is in it? Harold met my gaze. Evidence that your husband believed someone was becoming far too interested in what would happen after he was gone. The room suddenly felt smaller. Outside the conference room window, people walked along the sidewalk carrying coffee and briefcases. Ordinary lives continued as normal. Yet inside that office, something had shifted. For the first time, I began to suspect that the documents were not preserving memories at all. They were preserving warnings. And as Harold slowly opened the file, I realized Robert may have seen trouble coming years before the rest of us ever noticed it. Harold opened the file slowly and arranged several documents across the conference table. At first glance, nothing appeared unusual. There were photographs, handwritten notes, copies of correspondence, and records spanning several years. Yet the longer I looked at them, the more I understood that Robert had not been collecting paperwork. He had been documenting observations. Your husband believed patterns matter, Harold said quietly. He rarely focused on a single incident. He watched for repetition. I nodded. That sounded exactly like Robert. He had always been patient. If something felt wrong, he never rushed to judgment. He simply paid attention. Harold handed me the first photograph. It showed our family gathered around the dining room table during Thanksgiving 6 years earlier. Everyone was smiling. The turkey sat in the center of the table. Ryan was carving slices while Melissa laughed at something one of the grandchildren had said. On the back, Robert had written a short note. Melissa asked about the deed again today. Third time this year. A strange feeling settled in my stomach. Harold passed me another photograph. This one had been taken during a 4th of July barbecue. Again, there was a note. Melissa offered to help organize our office. She spent 20 minutes looking through legal folders before touching anything else. I stared at the handwriting. Suddenly, memories began returning. At the time, I had considered Melissa's behavior thoughtful, helpful even. Now I realized Robert had noticed details I completely missed. Another document followed. Then another. Each contained a brief observation. Nothing dramatic. Nothing accusatory. Just facts. Ryan asked what would happen to the house if something happened to us. Melissa wanted to know where important paperwork was stored. Melissa asked whether the mortgage was fully paid. Melissa asked if the property had been professionally appraised recently. One note stood out more than the others. 3 years before he died, Robert had written, Melissa seemed disappointed when I said the house would stay in Evelyn's control. I read that sentence twice. Then a third time. Why did he never tell me any of this? I asked softly. Harold folded his hands. Because he hoped there was an innocent explanation. The answer hurt more than I expected. Robert had loved our son deeply. The last thing he wanted was conflict inside the family. Yet he had continued documenting these moments anyway. Not because he wanted to accuse anyone. Because he wanted a record in case his concerns turned out to be justified. Harold opened another folder. Inside were copies of emails exchanged between him and Robert over several years. Most were routine. Others were not. One message immediately caught my attention. Robert had written, I may be overthinking this. I hope I am. But if I am not, I want Evelyn protected. My eyes lingered on the sentence. I could almost hear his voice speaking the words. Calm, rational, careful, never dramatic, never impulsive. Harold slid a final document toward me. It contained a timeline of observations Robert had compiled himself. Looking at the page, I realized something that made my chest tighten. The entries became more frequent after Ryan married Melissa. Not overnight. Gradually. Almost imperceptibly. Small questions became recurring questions. Casual interest became persistent interest. Over time, the pattern became impossible to ignore. Outside the conference room window, people moved through their day without a care in the world. Inside, I sat surrounded by pieces of a puzzle my husband had assembled years before. None of the documents proved wrongdoing. None of them contained accusations. Yet together they painted a picture that was impossible to dismiss. As I gathered the papers, another memory surfaced unexpectedly. Melissa standing in my office doorway years ago, smiling as she asked where we kept the property records. At the time, I had answered without a second thought. Now, for the first time, I found myself wondering why she had wanted to know in the first place. When I arrived home from Harold's office, I placed the folder on the kitchen table and sat quietly beside it for nearly an hour. The house felt the same as it always had. Sunlight spilled across the hardwood floor. The clock above the refrigerator ticked steadily. A breeze moved gently through the curtains near the sink. Yet something inside me had changed. For years, I had accepted certain conversations at face value. Now I found myself replaying them from a different perspective. The memories came slowly at first, then faster, one after another. I remembered a Sunday dinner nearly 4 years earlier. Melissa had been helping clear the table. As she carried plates into the kitchen, she casually asked whether the house was fully paid off. The question had seemed harmless. Adults discussed finances all the time. When I told her the mortgage had been paid years ago, she smiled and said that was wonderful. Then she immediately asked whether property values in our neighborhood had increased recently. At the time, I thought she was making conversation. Now I was not so sure. Another memory surfaced. Ryan and Melissa had visited shortly after Robert retired. We spent the afternoon on the back patio drinking iced tea. The conversation drifted from travel plans to retirement goals. Melissa laughed and said something I had forgotten until that very moment. A house is just a house, she had said. People should enjoy life while they can. 10 minutes later, she asked Robert whether he had ever considered selling and moving somewhere smaller. Robert had answered politely. The subject changed. But now, years later, I realized she had spent most of that afternoon discussing the property without ever mentioning the memories attached to it. Then there was the filing cabinet. That memory returned with startling clarity. About 5 years earlier, Melissa offered to help organize paperwork while I was recovering from a minor illness. I remembered feeling grateful. She spent hours sorting folders and labeling documents. At one point, I walked into the office and found several legal files spread across the desk. Melissa smiled and explained she was simply trying to make everything easier to find. I thanked her. Today, I remembered something else. She had not started with utility bills or household records. She had started with property documents. The realization left me staring out the kitchen window for a long time. None of these moments seemed alarming by themselves. That was what made them so easy to overlook. They were hidden inside ordinary conversations and ordinary acts of kindness. Yet together they formed a pattern that looked remarkably similar to the one Robert had documented. A few days later, Melissa called unexpectedly. Her voice sounded warm and cheerful. She asked how I was doing and whether I needed help around the house. Then she mentioned a new retirement community that had opened nearby. You would love it there, she said. Everything is modern. Everything is convenient. I listened quietly. That sounds nice, I replied. There was a brief pause. You know, she continued, you should not have to worry about complicated paperwork anymore. Ryan and I could always help with things like that. The comment was delivered gently, almost lovingly. Yet something about it stayed with me after the call ended. Robert's notes suddenly felt less like observations and more like warnings. Later that evening, I opened the folder again. Tucked between 2 documents was another handwritten note. It contained only a single sentence. People reveal themselves most clearly when they believe they are being helpful. I sat there staring at those words while the afternoon light slowly faded from the room. The more I remembered, the harder it became to ignore what Robert had spent years noticing. And for the first time, I began wondering whether he had prepared far more than a collection of notes. 2 days after finding Robert's note, I returned to Harold's office carrying every document I had discovered in the cedar box. This time, Harold seemed less interested in the photographs and more interested in a sealed envelope I had overlooked during our previous meetings. It had been tucked beneath several folders at the bottom of the box. The envelope was marked with a date from nearly 8 years earlier. Harold examined it carefully before handing it back to me. I think Robert intended for you to find this only after everything else started making sense, he said. My hands felt strangely unsteady as I opened it. Inside was a letter and several pages of legal paperwork. The letter was brief. Robert's handwriting remained neat and deliberate as always. Evelyn, if you have reached this point, then you have probably begun noticing the same things I noticed. Please remember that preparation is not the same thing as suspicion. I never wanted conflict. I simply wanted certainty. I continued reading. Over the next several paragraphs, Robert explained something I had never known. Years earlier, he had worked with Harold to establish a trust designed specifically to protect both me and our home. The purpose was not to control anyone. The purpose was to ensure that every major decision remained mine alone. No family member could pressure, influence, or redirect ownership without my voluntary consent. I turned to the attached documents. The language was formal, but the meaning was clear. Robert had thought through every possible scenario. What surprised me most was a section Harold asked me to read twice. The trust contained what he called a protection clause. If any beneficiary attempted to exert undue pressure regarding the sale, transfer, or management of the property, certain inheritance rights could be reduced or forfeited entirely. I looked up from the papers. He actually included this? Harold nodded. He did. Why? Harold remained quiet for several moments. Then he answered carefully. Because he noticed a growing pattern and hoped the existence of the clause would prevent future problems. The room felt very still. For years, I had viewed Robert's notes as observations. Suddenly, I realized they were something more. They were the foundation supporting a plan he had spent years building. Not because he expected the worst, because he wanted me protected if the worst happened. Harold opened another folder and removed a copy of an old letter Robert had sent him. One sentence had been highlighted. I trust my son. What I do not trust is the influence of expectations when money and property become involved. Reading those words felt like hearing Robert speak from across time. He had never stopped loving Ryan. That was obvious. Yet he had understood something I failed to see. Good people sometimes change when they begin believing they are entitled to something that does not belong to them. As I sat there reviewing the documents, memories from the previous few years suddenly looked different. The repeated conversations about downsizing, the constant suggestions about retirement communities, the unexpected interest in property values. None of it seemed random anymore. Robert had connected those dots years before I ever considered doing so. When our meeting ended, Harold handed me copies of every document. Keep these somewhere safe, he said. I promised I would. As I walked toward my car, I felt neither angry nor frightened. What I felt was clarity. For weeks, I had been uncovering pieces of a puzzle. Now the picture was finally coming into focus. Robert had not left me a collection of memories. He had left me a shield. And for the first time, I began to suspect that Ryan and Melissa were far closer to triggering the very protections he created than either of them realized. 3 days after my meeting with Harold, Ryan called and asked if he and Melissa could come over for dinner. His tone was unusually cheerful. I agreed immediately. By then, I had learned that some of the most revealing moments arrived disguised as ordinary family visits. Saturday evening arrived warm and clear. I spent the afternoon preparing a simple meal. Roast chicken, mashed potatoes, green beans, and an apple pie cooling on the counter. The familiar routine reminded me of the years when family dinners felt uncomplicated. Back then, conversations centered around school events, vacations, and grandchildren. Lately, they seemed to revolve around one thing: my future. Ryan and Melissa arrived carrying a bottle of sparkling cider and smiles that seemed a little too polished. Melissa complimented the house before she even sat down. Ryan asked how I was feeling and whether I had been getting enough rest. Everything appeared perfectly normal, yet I found myself noticing details Robert would have noticed. The quick glance Melissa gave the dining room. The way Ryan looked toward the hallway leading to my office. The brief exchange of eye contact between them whenever. The conversation slowed. We sat down to dinner. The meal began pleasantly enough. We talked about work, the weather, and local events. Then, exactly as I expected, Melissa brought up a new retirement community 20 miles away. It is beautiful, she said. They have walking trails, activities, and maintenance-free homes. Ryan nodded enthusiastically. Honestly, Mom, it seems perfect for someone who wants less stress. I smiled and continued eating. That sounds nice. Melissa seemed encouraged by my response. The best part is that you would not have to worry about such a large property anymore. There it was again. The property. The house. The future of everything Robert and I had spent decades building. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes. By the end, they had mentioned downsizing for separate times. They had discussed home values twice. They had mentioned convenience 6 or 7 times. Yet neither of them had asked the one question that mattered most. Did I actually want to leave? After dinner, we moved into the living room. Melissa opened her purse and pulled out several brochures. My eyes immediately settled on them. Retirement communities, townhouses, smaller homes. She had come prepared. I thought you might like to look at these, she said casually. Ryan smiled. No pressure, of course. No pressure. The phrase almost made me laugh. Instead, I simply accepted the brochures and placed them on the coffee table. Then I did something neither of them expected. I nodded thoughtfully. Actually, I said, I have been thinking about making some changes. The effect was immediate. Melissa sat forward. Ryan's eyes brightened. For the first time all evening, neither of them seemed capable of hiding their excitement. Really? Ryan asked. Really, I replied. Maybe it is time to consider new possibilities. The conversation became noticeably warmer after that. Melissa began discussing real estate agents she trusted. Ryan offered to help me organize paperwork. They spoke with the confidence of people who believed they were finally getting exactly what they wanted. By the time they left, both seemed happier than they had been in years. I stood on the porch and waved as their car disappeared down the street. Then I went back inside and locked the door. The smile faded from my face. I walked directly into Robert's old office and opened the folder Harold had given me. Every document remained exactly where I had left it. Every protection remained intact. As I sat down at the desk, I remembered something Robert once told me. The easiest way to learn what people truly expect is to let them believe they have already won. And judging by the look on Ryan and Melissa's faces that evening, they believed victory was finally within reach. The following Tuesday arrived sooner than I expected. I woke before sunrise and sat alone at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee cooling between my hands. The house was quiet. Morning light slowly crept across the hardwood floor. For a few minutes, I allowed myself to simply sit there and remember Robert. The way he used to read the newspaper at that same table. The way he always noticed details everyone else overlooked. Back then, I thought his caution was simply part of his personality. Now I understood it had been one of the greatest gifts he ever gave me. At 10 o'clock, my phone rang. Ryan. Just checking in, Mom, he said cheerfully. Everything still good for this afternoon? Of course, I replied. There was a brief pause before he added something that stayed with me long after the call ended. I really think this is the smartest decision you have made in years. The words were delivered kindly, yet something about them felt strange. As though the decision had already been made. As though my role was simply to agree with it. An hour later, Melissa called as well. She sounded excited. She mentioned several homes she thought would suit me perfectly. She talked about convenience, simplicity, and fresh starts. Not once did she ask whether I wanted any of those things. By noon, I had gathered the trust documents, Robert's letters, and every file Harold had instructed me to bring. Then I drove downtown. Harold's office stood exactly where it always had. Quiet, professional, unchanging. Ryan and Melissa were already waiting when I arrived. Ryan greeted me with a warm smile. Melissa carried a notebook filled with handwritten notes. She looked prepared. More prepared than someone attending a simple informational meeting should have looked. We exchanged greetings and settled into the conference room. The atmosphere felt almost optimistic. Ryan leaned back comfortably in his chair. Melissa placed her notebook on the table and organized several pages of questions. Watching them, I could not shake the feeling that they expected the afternoon to confirm something they had already decided. A few minutes later, Harold entered carrying several folders. He greeted everyone politely before taking his seat at the head of the table. The meeting began with ordinary discussions. Property records, estate planning, legal procedures. Ryan nodded frequently. Melissa occasionally wrote notes in the margins of her notebook. Everything appeared routine. Then Melissa asked a question. If Evelyn decides to move, she said, how quickly could the property be listed? The wording caught my attention immediately. Not if, when. Harold noticed it too. I could tell from the brief glance he gave me before answering. That would depend entirely on Mrs. Parker's decision, he replied calmly. Melissa smiled politely, but I noticed her pen stop moving. Ryan cleared his throat. We are just trying to help her understand her options. Harold nodded. Of course. The conversation continued. Yet with each passing minute, subtle assumptions began surfacing. Melissa referred to the house as an asset several times. Ryan discussed future plans that seemed to require proceeds from a sale. Neither of them appeared aware of what they were revealing. They seemed convinced the outcome was already moving in their favor. Finally, Harold closed one folder and reached for another. The room grew noticeably quieter. This file was thicker, older, more carefully organized than the others. I recognized it immediately. It contained the documents Robert had spent years preparing. Ryan glanced at the folder curiously. Melissa straightened in her chair. Neither of them understood what they were about to see. As Harold slowly opened the file, I realized something. For weeks, I had been uncovering the truth piece by piece. In the next few minutes, Ryan and Melissa were finally going to meet the version of Robert they had never truly understood. Harold opened the folder and carefully arranged several documents across the conference table. The room fell silent. Ryan leaned forward slightly. Melissa set down her pen. For the first time that afternoon, neither of them looked completely comfortable. Harold adjusted his glasses and began speaking. Several years before his passing, Robert Parker established the Parker Family Preservation Trust. Ryan frowned. I have never heard of that. Very few people had, Harold replied calmly. That was intentional. He slid a copy of the trust agreement toward us. I watched Ryan skim the first page. Melissa followed along beside him. Their expressions remained neutral at first. Then Harold continued. The trust was designed to ensure that all decisions regarding Mrs. Parker's residence remained entirely under her control. Ryan nodded slowly. That makes sense. There is more, Harold said. He opened another document and placed it on top of the first. Robert also included several protective provisions. The room became very still. Harold read directly from the document. Any beneficiary who attempts to exert undue pressure regarding the sale, transfer, management, or disposition of the protected property may forfeit certain inheritance rights at the discretion of the trust administrator. Ryan's eyes lifted from the page. Melissa stopped turning pages altogether. Neither spoke. Harold remained professional and unemotional. Robert believed that future decisions should belong to Evelyn Parker and nobody else. The silence that followed felt heavier than anything that had been said. Finally, Ryan cleared his throat. Are you saying Dad expected someone to pressure Mom? Harold folded his hands. I am saying your father spent years documenting concerns he felt were important enough to address. Then he opened one final folder. Inside were copies of Robert's notes. The same observations I had spent weeks reading. Questions about property values. Questions about deeds. Questions about future ownership. Questions repeated over years. Not accusations. Not attacks. Just patterns. Melissa stared at the papers without speaking. Ryan read several pages before slowly setting them down. For the first time all afternoon, neither of them appeared confident. Harold then handed me a final letter. Your husband wanted this read only if we reached this point. My fingers tightened around the paper as I unfolded it. The handwriting was instantly familiar. Evelyn, if this letter is being read, then you have already discovered what took me years to understand. A home is not valuable because of what someone can sell it for. A home is valuable because of the life built inside it. I paused for a moment before continuing. Never allow anyone to convince you that your memories are obstacles. Never allow anyone to decide your future for you. The people who truly love you will respect your choices, even when those choices do not benefit them. When I finished reading, nobody spoke. Ryan stared quietly at the table. Melissa looked down at her notebook. The questions she had prepared remained unanswered because they no longer mattered. The truth was sitting in front of all of us. Robert had trusted me. He had protected me. And he had seen far more than anyone realized. Eventually, Harold closed the folders and stood. The meeting was over. No arguments followed. No dramatic confrontation occurred. None was necessary. Some truths speak loudly enough on their own. I gathered Robert's letters and placed them carefully into my bag. Then I walked out of the conference room and into the afternoon sunlight. For weeks, I had been told that I was holding on to things that no longer mattered. Old letters, old memories, old promises. Yet those very things had guided me when confusion surrounded me. Those very things had protected me when I needed protection most. As I reached my car, I looked up at the clear blue sky and thought about Robert. He had been gone for 3 years. Yet in a strange way, he had still managed to keep his promise. He had not left me wealth. He had not left me instructions for every problem life might bring. He had left me something better. He had left me the confidence to trust what I saw with my own eyes. And because of that, I returned home that day with something far more valuable than any inheritance. I returned home knowing that my future still belonged to me.